Charges against me.
Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. You can see it in my eyes. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Do it till the day I die. You can see all in my eyes. I live for the struggle and strive. That's how I know that I'm alive. Rep it to the day I die. Revolutionary wise, God is style. Look and fly. My art was my politics. Bitch, I ain't a fucking lie. Thug love, where it started. Reminiscing, getting high. When it comes to real, ain't got no ties. I be hustling mine. You have no idea what I truly sacrifice. I will get it. My soul will fly. Me, my ancestors, and I. Aside of certainty, invited me to break a couple pies. Told me it wouldn't be much longer till I could travel skies. What do you see when you look at me? I said someone free, and she pulled out a chair and said there's room at the table just for me. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. You can see it in my eyes. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Do it till the day I die.
He agreed to talk with me in Havana. Chesimard, or Assata Shakur, insisted she had killed no one and was railroaded by an all-white jury by what she called racist New Jersey state troopers.
But because I knew that the racist legal system in the United States, I would receive no justice. I was also afraid that I would be murdered in prison.
Time it out, he said float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Malcolm said it happens, so the best of us remain to see. Majesty said, baby girl, just make sure that you keep it G. And Fred Ho, pass me the torch. It was all a dream. Walking up in my crib, make bitches wanna clean. You should start with your heart. If that ain't right, you ain't a queen. Or a goddess, still a princess, and need some nurturing. I suggest if you can't stand the heat, get out the fucking ring. Revolutionize what you put in your body, you are what you eat. Just because I'm on it, don't think I won't take it back. The streets, I try to walk a peaceful path and let my soul free. I be stepping through portals, this realm isn't for me. Halfway in and out, everybody surrounding me, I doubt I'm losing friends cause I can't trust the word out of my mouth. All I wanna do is spread freedom and make it out. When I do burn my temples, spread my ashes to the south. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. You can see it in my eyes. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Revolutionize, gotta revolutionize. Do it till the day I die.
Do I look there or look there? Okay. Okay. My name is Alexa Ann Watson, and I am the great-great-great-granddaughter of
Frederick Douglass is my great-great-great-great
great-great-great-granddaughter of Frederick Douglass.
I am the great-great-great-great-grandchild.
I've been counting on my fingers since I was like 5.
This is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom.
Fellow citizens, I shall not presume to dwell at length on the associations that cluster about this day. The simple story of it is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects.
Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men, and if they did not go mad, they became restive under this tree.
With brave men, there's always a remedy for oppression. They succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary.
Fellow citizens, pardon me. Allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence?
Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us?
I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary.
Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common.
The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me.
The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me.
This 4th of July is yours, not mine.
You may rejoice. I must mourn.
I'm one of the co-founders, Matt Meyer, of Resistance in Brooklyn, and I also work with War Resisters International, International Fellowship of Reconciliation, and as the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm very honored to be with this grouping as we begin this vital discussion about this topic in this historical moment. So I'm going to pass it over to my RnB comrade Meg, who will introduce the session with greetings, love, and solidarity for all.
I'm Meg Starr. I use she. I'm one of the co-founders of Resistance in Brooklyn, currently also working with the National Boricua Human Rights Network and Extinction Rebellion. This is a time that has called into question a lot of issues about what a white ally with people impacted most severely by the issues of white imperialism, people of color, Black people, what is successful allyship and camaraderie. And I'm really excited and honored that we're going to be joined today to talk about this by Wendy Marshall from the People's Strike Coordinating Committee and Black Caucus, a leader, a Philadelphia-based queer organizer and author of Potent Mana, Lessons in Power and Healing. Judith Merkinson, longtime radical, anti-racist, anti-imperialist, feminist organizer, former president of the San Francisco Bay Area National Lawyers Guild. Abdul Ali A. Muhammad, African-American HIV and queer activist, founder of the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative. Michael Lodenthal, Peace and Justice Studies Association Executive Director, founder of the Prosecution Project, author of The Politics of Attack. Sienna Mann, Project Director of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition. We want to start by having all 5 panelists share some thoughts on our broad topic, talking about their own experience of white, anti-racist, anti-imperialist allyship and solidarity, and the struggle to implement Black liberationist and or people of color leadership in mixed groups and coalitions. So starting us off will be Judith Merkinson.
Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to be here. My name is Judith Merkinson, or everyone calls me Merk. I go by the pronouns she and her. I've been an activist for many, many years, and this is a question, of course, that I've been involved with since the beginning of my activism, when I began doing work with the Black Panther Party around the issue of the Panther 21. I would say, first of all, I would like to talk about the issue of allies. And actually, I don't like the word ally because I feel like it puts you on the side. Really, I think for white people and Europeans, we have to say that the reason that we do what we do, the reason that why we struggle for a very different kind of world is because it's morally repugnant to us to live in the world that we live in, that it goes against the grain for us to watch, for instance, the video of George Floyd, that becomes something about ourselves, not just something that we ally with, that solidarity is something that you have to take inside and say, this is a struggle that I'm going to make for myself and for really creating a kind of different world for the future and for your children and grandchildren. And I want to just talk about, you asked what was one example of solidarity. I mean, I've been involved in many different struggles, but recently, or in the past 10 years, I worked on the case of the San Francisco 8. And perhaps people don't know what the San Francisco 8, they were 8 former Black Panthers who were brought back to trial in San Francisco in 2008 over an issue that had happened in 1971 and 1973. And it was people in their 60s and 70s who were being arrested. And they were facing very, very heavy murder charges and very heavy charges. And when we started, they were all in jail. And they included 2 political prisoners already, which was Herman Bell and Jalil Muntaqin. And we built a broad coalition. And when we started, everybody was convinced that they were going to go to jail. Like, it was just accepted. And we built a coalition, and nobody went to jail, except for the 2 that were already incarcerated. And the way that we did it was that we actually paid attention to what they wanted. There was a lot of struggle over the case, over whether to take a deal because people were facing such heavy charges, over how to do it. And we decided we listened to them. They led us. And as a result, we built a coalition together and we got them off. And that's a really good example of how we negotiated this process. And, when you're working with lawyers, this is a very difficult process because they like to run their case. And so this was also negotiating all the time. And we built this coalition that included government officials, all different kinds of people, and it was successful. And I think that's a really good example. Another example I would talk about is the struggle in Haiti, where we worked to bring back Jean-Bertrand Aristide to office after he had been in exile for 7 years. And we worked together with Haitians and built a coalition. The majority reason that he went back to Haiti was because of the broad grassroots movement of Lavalas and the Haitian people. But we worked with them very closely and continue to work with them. And I think, one thing I would say is that when you look at the struggle against white supremacy, you have to look at it as something that's not just systemic to the United States, but also is systemic to our role in the world. And Haiti is a Black republic, the first to get rid of slavery. And we have to pay attention, and the US has been in there since the very beginning. And so this is another example. The other thing I would say is that people have to be in it for the long haul. And when you start your life, it's very difficult to say, I'm going to do this for my entire life. But that's sort of the struggle that you have. And I think that's very important. It's not just about how do you be a better person, which is one thing, or how do you have personal interactions with people. It's how do you actually change the power structure? How do you participate in a movement that challenges what this country does and what this country is about? And you have to accept the fact that it goes up and down, but you have to be in it. And you also have to accept the fact that the leadership, that especially when Black people and Black liberation leads, the whole country erupts and the whole country benefits. And I think that that's a very important lesson for people to have. The other thing I would say is that you have to build, and then I'll end there, you have to build a movement that's very broad and has a very broad perspective. And now we use the word intersectional. but that can come in many different forms. And we have to say that the way that this country operates is that it's racist, it's white supremacist, it's based in heteropatriarchy. It deals with, it's very violent. Gender violence is omnipresent. The oppression of women, the oppression of all genders. We have to look at liberation as a full package. And unless we do that, we are not going to build a movement that's successful, because what we want is a world where there's liberation for all people and all people get to be whoever they want. And I think that to be an anti-imperialist and to be a liberationist, you have to view that very, very deeply. And you have to build a movement that respects all life, whether it's the earth or people or the entire planet. And I think, and I hope that we're building such a movement today, but we'll see.
Hey, hi, I'm Wendy. My pronouns are she, they. I have to say that I have been and still am pretty stumped by how to answer these questions. I feel like white supremacy is such an overwhelming force, constantly present in every crack and nook and cranny, that it's really hard for me to think of ways to sound intelligent answering these questions. I feel like while I can think of stories in my life of individuals, Matt and Meg being two of those individuals, who have demonstrated allyship and solidarity, it feels also really, really complicated. This country, and therefore the rest of the world, because of the impact this country has, is so extremely fucked up. And all of us, but especially white people, are so crazy that it's hard to understand how to ask this question. I mean, I think maybe more clearly about what are the things that white people could do to demonstrate, what are the processes that white people need to go through in order to get them to the place of allyship or solidarity. I guess that's more about what I think of. What is it, whatever else is true, white people come with more wealth, more standing, more status, and are much more used to hearing themselves talk and say what they think needs to happen. But the fact remains that Europe, including white people, is the source of the mess of the planet that we live in. And so that's part of the big dilemma, right? To deal with, how do you get a people who have despoiled and raped and pillaged to figure out what it means to be an ally or in solidarity? And I feel like that's a really big question that I can't begin to answer outside of individual relationships I have with individual comrades. I feel like it just, even thinking about it totally exhausts me, right? Even thinking about the question, parsing it out and trying to put it into a box. I have had experiences, I guess I want to talk about Stadium Stompers, which was one of my favorite organizing experiences lately, which involved historically Black North Central Philadelphia, and a coalition that grew up of community leaders, mostly Black, middle-aged Black women, me, a middle-aged Black woman is an adjunct at Temple, and students who were, cross-racially students. But there were a lot of white students involved in that coalition, and it was interesting because eventually we came to define ourselves as a multi-racial, intergenerational, Black-led movement. And it's not that there weren't a lot of tensions, because there were. But somehow we managed to do what we set out to do, which is to stop State Temple University from building a stadium in historically Black North Central Philadelphia. So I think that as a small and concrete example might be, yeah, that's what comes to my head. I think, so the question, how can we best express and actualize Black liberationists, or people of color leadership in mixed groups or coalitions? The we in there kind of nags at me and worries me, because I want to know who is it, who are we who are hoping to actualize Black and BIPOC leadership? And, you know, this question also is just like too big for me to wrap my mind around in some kind of ways, or to talk about, right? Because you know, one of the effects of white supremacy and of racial capital is that Black people learn to be silent and learn not to exercise agency and leadership and views. And especially when we think about bringing that all together with sort of the relentless chatter of white voices, especially and including in the left, then, you know, that's a problem, right? It's a problem, because it's like white people cock block leadership positions. And so it's also hard for me to think concretely about when that doesn't, you know, when that doesn't happen. White people are an obstacle to combating white supremacy. So I think white people need to be race traders. Yeah, these are really big questions, and I'm very sorry if I haven't answered them as clearly, but check.
My name is Abdul Ali. I'm from Philly, and I have the honor of coming next after Wendy on this here broadcast. So I love Wendy. And I want to correct something that was in my bio. So I don't identify as African American. Sorry if I missed that. I don't know where that came from. But I'm Black, and I'm non-binary. I'm someone living with HIV. I am someone who is born to two parents, both impacted by the carceral state in a lot of ways, and I think that's useful. And I co-founded an organization that does a lot of workers' rights organizing work, specifically for Black and brown trans people, non-binary people, POS people in Philly, called the Black and Brown Workers Co-op, and we do a lot of anti-displacement work as well. And so shout out to Stadium Stompers for doing a lot of work in Philly and being an inspiration for us to focus on anti-displacement in Philadelphia. I agree with Wendy. I share a lot of the same kind of tension around these two questions. And I also agree with Merk around, like, I can call you Merk, right? Around the piece, like, one, the language that we use, right? Language is imperfect, we know that. But I do struggle with allyship as a phrase or a term. And so in a lot of spaces that I'm in, people say accomplice, but I also don't know if that necessarily gets to what we're talking about, or what I vision white people's role to be. So I can just talk about some of the things that make me uncomfortable, and then maybe get to a place where I'm talking about what I vision and hope for. But I think the problem is that all of these phrases or terminology exists in the world that we live in, and because white supremacy is a global system, it impacts even the language we use and how we use that language. So I think when people say allyship, oftentimes it's them positioning themselves, right, in movement spaces. It's like either I'm positioning myself in a movement or I'm claiming proximity to struggle or Black people or what have you, right? Like and then oftentimes claiming proximity or using that identifier then makes people believe that they don't have to be accountable. Like, right? Like I've seen, you know, folk use allyship in a way to silence Black leadership or Black dissent in like group spaces, right? Like, oh, well, I showed up free. I'll give you a real life example, right? This is a friend of mine who we did a lot of anti-war work together some years ago, like the early 2000s. And when a conversation came up about anti-Blackness, specifically around the election of Trump and how white women, you know, were a big percentage of folk who voted for him. This person is Jewish and didn't want to be lumped into this kind of box of whiteness, and kind of challenged me on like this kind of grouping, right? That, you know, Jewish people have been in solidarity with Black people, have been oppressed. And, you know, we kind of talked out the difference that we had. And, you know, I acknowledged a lot of what this person said and stated that in the US context, Jewish people are in a lot of ways either aspiring to whiteness or benefit from whiteness. And that's what I was talking about. And this person pulled out some receipts from years ago, like, oh, well, you know, I took you to the hospital that one time, you know, when no one else was caring for you. And so, you know, how can you say that I am problematic like white people in these ways because I cared for you in this very particular way when you needed to be cared for? And I kind of pointed out to her, you know, this is a problem. The fact that you are using this previous like support and care that you have given as a way to silence like my critique or my concern or my discomfort about white supremacy and the ways in which we're all socialized in it. And that person didn't want to be friends, you know, took me off of Facebook. And for a few years, we didn't talk. And, you know, within the past year or so, we kind of became reacquainted. But I think that is like one of the struggles that I have with white folks, like to use like previous support or care as a way to silence like discomfort or you know, conflict, right? Conflict in that way was just like an example of like what not to do, right? And so that's why I'm concerned when people like try on that label as if it's permanent, as if it's not
a process.
Right, a process or something that you have to work at all the time or something, you know, it just, when people try on that label as if it's like this, it's to me, it's aspirational, right? It's something that you work towards. It's an end. It's like an end versus like, this is who I am and this is absolute. And like, it doesn't mean that you're not going to show up as a white person in the world because you're socialized as a white person. So you're going to always have to figure out how to navigate the world from that place. Just like I'm always going to have to figure out how to navigate the world as a Black person, right? And so I think when folks understand that it's a process and it's not something that is absolute, I think that's a better framework, personally. And then I think the way I vision this is like, we have to create a world where allyship isn't needed. So if you're like, you know what I mean? The idea of this construct being needed, just like we need to vision and work towards a world where like, we don't have to think about the nonprofit industrial complex filling the gaps, right? Of like need, right? Like I think about this from that standpoint a lot because I worked in HIV prevention. And there are people who are tied to the idea that nonprofits should exist forever, right? That's going to always, there's always going to exist this need to be paternalistic and show up for folks who can't show up for themselves. And if you have that framework, then you're anti-Black. Like you have the framework that you're always going to be showing up in these ways or taking care of folk in these ways or helping folks understand theory in these ways or practice in these ways, and I feel like that's an anti-Black place to organize and you know, organize from personally. And so if your work is committed to dismantling these systems so that we don't have to claim allyship, then I feel like that's a better like vision, right? Like I want to be in a world where I don't have to think that I'm an ally or exist as an ally. Yeah, I think like working towards a world that doesn't require allyship is a framework that makes sense to me. But holding on to that identity as like a thing to hold is, I think, problematic and leads to a lot of like unnecessary conflict, right? Because I've, as a Black person, I spend way too much time trying to convince white people that when I say something is a problem, I'm not talking about them as an individual, I'm talking about the ways in which they have been socialized. And there's a lot of labor that I've spent over the years dealing with white folks who feel guilty or want to cry, and it's like, that's not useful. I'm not talking about, you're a great individual. We're not talking about your individual qualities. We're talking about the ways you interact with me as a Black person because of the ways in which white supremacy socialized you and myself. And I say lastly, the piece around Black leadership, to Wendy's like earlier point, I just want to reaffirm that around oftentimes anti-Blackness in like multiracial coalitions show up as like not following the strategy of Black people, right? I've been in groups where I've, you know, their expertise around direct action isn't valued, right? Or you say something around strategy and somebody's like, well, you know, maybe we can do it this way. And a lot of that has to do with class too. A lot of it has to do with race and class. And about like, oh, I study poli-sci, or I'm like this bona fide Marxist, or this person has studied all these theories, and so I'm the theory person, and you know, and I'm talking to you, Black person, and assuming that you have no basis of like knowledge, right? Like you have, I'm assuming that you don't know about Marx. I'm assuming that you don't know about theories. So like that is a problem too, right? Not uplifting Black folks who have come up with theories that we use. Like an example that Merck mentioned was intersectional, and I'll end there, right? When we talk about intersectionality, we have to uplift and name Kimberly Crenshaw, because if we're not doing that, we're like dismissing the work of a Black woman, right? And in talking about Kimberly Crenshaw, we always have to mention that this was a legal theory, right? It was about Black women in the workplace who were being impacted by both racism and sexism, right? And how that made them not get promotions, made them lose their job. So that was what intersectionality was about, right? It was about like, no, because the framework was racism doesn't exist at this institution because Black men have positions of power. But it was like, no, Kimberly Crenshaw was saying, no, Black women have a very particular experience with racism and sexism at these intersections and how they're impacted by these systems. And so we're not just talking about Black cisgender men, we're talking about how Black women are being forgotten or ousted from these organizations because of their identities. And so we always have to like uplift that when we talk about intersectionality. And I get like the need and want to use that to talk about movement being focused on a lot of identities. But I think, you know, always mentioning Kimberly and grounding that in her work is a way that we can practice being in solidarity with Black people. And the last thing I'll say is the same thing goes for Assata Shakur's chant that people love to use about, you know, we have nothing to lose but our chains. I've heard it in many contexts where people are just like, oh, it's the same we like to say. And it's like, no, this Black woman, right, who escaped and got away from oppression in the US, these are her words. So let's uplift and affirm that. And I'll end there. Thank y'all.
So thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for what's already been said. So my name is Michael Lodenthal. I use he, him pronouns. I'm currently living in Cincinnati, Ohio, though I am from right around where Wendy is in Philadelphia. And I serve a few roles. I guess I was invited here because I work as the executive director of the Peace and Justice Studies Association, which is, in a sense, an academic coalition of people who work on issues related to social justice and peace. I also run a research center called the Prosecution Project. It's not a fancy research center with an office and walls. We have no institutional home. Myself and most of the other people who work with us are unemployed currently, but we try to untangle the criminal justice system, specifically how political violence is prosecuted. What I want to speak to are some of the experiences that I've had working in transnational movements. Mostly I work as a trainer and an investigator. So I'm often brought in by small community-based organizations or campus-based organizations to help them typically not develop strategy, but typically secure strategies they already have. So I focus on counter-repression strategies and counter-surveillance and movement defense. So I'm often brought in on request to help people do that. And so I would kind of want to speak with those experiences in mind. Wendy, I think, said it best earlier in that this is a really hard question. And for me, as a person, as a white person, as a white Jew, one of the challenges here is that every example I can think of, in hindsight, I have pretty strong and damning critiques of. So I was, thinking of like, oh, well, there's this thing happened, but with the benefit of hindsight, what seemed tactically appropriate is strategically poor. And so that's part of what I think is really hard is correctly marrying the tactics we're trying to use. So for lack of a better word, in the streets, to the strategies which we're trying to use in movement building. So I can think of a few examples and I'll raise them. But if someone else were to raise these examples, I think I have a pretty quick kind of critique about why this actually isn't great. So with that caveat. But generally, what I think is really important is white folks, and we're talking about race, but I think you could extend this to all forms of privilege. So if we want to say able-bodied folks, or if we want to say, people of certain ages or immigrant status or citizenship status, but to keep it focused. So in general, that white folks making themselves or making ourselves available and vulnerable, and I don't mean emotionally vulnerable, though that's obviously clearly important, but making ourselves vulnerable to risk. Right, whether that's risk of injury or risk of prosecution, if you're thinking of street demonstrations. Most of the examples I can think of kind of fall into that category. There's the kind of classical examples, which again, I kind of first want to go to, but then have pretty strong critiques of in a sense, white human shielding, which is often, I think, maybe the shorthand for it. If people are familiar, there was a very famous, and I think well captured incident of this in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 during the Unite the Right rally of white folks basically putting themselves in between neo-Nazis and mostly Black clergy. The example that really shines through for me is the multi-decade work of protective accompaniment, specifically in places like Palestine or Colombia is another place where it's happening a lot. So I've spent significant time in the Palestinian territories helping to coordinate some of these things. And the basic idea is for people to use racial, ethnic, and citizenship privilege to form a physical barrier between those who lack it. So basically putting European and white folks and people read as European and white in front of soldiers, and behind them having demonstrators to reduce the risks to lethal violence. Now, again, I have some, I think, pretty strong critiques of that on a strategic level, but as a tactic, I think it is interesting to look at. But again, it goes down to the kind of individual psychologies and motivations of people. And there are people who do that who are conflict tourists. And there are people who would do that because they wanted to save the poor brown people from all the mean things that are happening to them. And there's a lot of really toxic shit that motivates people to do that. So I think there are some challenges with why people do that. One of the examples that is intimate to me, because it's sort of a lot of the work that I do, is, and I should say there's no way to quantify to say that this is mostly being done by white people, but the 10 people I'm thinking of in my head happen to be white. Of people doing infiltrations, specifically of far-right networks. That's been a really big thing, specifically since the kind of more obvious rise of them in 2017. So I work teaching people what we call open source intelligence, basically how to identify people from photographs and things like that. And oftentimes these larger campaigns involve people who can pass for neo-Nazis and white supremacists meeting with white supremacists and, having fake meetings and photographing them and whatnot. There are some pretty obvious points there where, there are some people who can and some people who cannot do that work, regardless of how you, are phenotypically or epigenetically. Like, you have to look a certain way for people to believe that you're not a white supremacist recruit. From tattoos to skin tone, there's all sorts of things. So I think that those are interesting examples. And where I've seen them the best is where basically white folks use race privilege to infiltrate these groups, right, to be accepted into these groups, and then use that position to, the fancy word is exfiltrate, right, to exfiltrate information to communities being affected. So I can think of a ton of examples that are they range from scary to funny. One of the ones that comes to mind is every year for a fair bit of time, there was a rally in Washington, D.C. around April, led by the National Socialist Movement. Just to be clear, that's a neo-Nazi organization, and Aryan Nations, which is obviously a neo-Nazi organization. They eventually branded it into Rock Against Zionism to try to kind of capitalize on pro-Palestinian sentiment that was building in the US. Anyway, one of these groups of anti-fascist white folks basically found the bus company that had rented the buses to the neo-Nazis and preempted that action. In other words, they traveled to Baltimore, where the Nazis were traveling south to Washington. And while the Nazis were asleep in a motel, the individuals destroyed their means of transportation. So when they woke up the next day, they couldn't get to the rally. That's an example. And there's a fair number of examples like that. But generally, the examples I'm trying to think of is places where people, I love, Wendy's used the term race traitor, which is like a really common term used by folks in this community about 10 years ago. I haven't heard it in a fair bit. But the idea of like kind of using your privilege to get behind, in a sense, enemy lines and then betraying that trust is, I think, kind of awesome and pretty great. And so the last thing I'll say is that, there's a lot of examples of these, but I think oftentimes I'm drawn to those examples and I forget some of the ways in which we do long-term, mundane, glory-less, things without glory roles, whether that's cooking at mass gatherings. I end up coordinating a lot of childcare, whether it's doing long-term prisoner support, or even short-term prisoner support. Right now, the work I've been doing this past 2 weeks is tracking all of the federal prosecutions related to the George Floyd uprising, and that's an example, maybe. And so, although we sometimes find ourselves in these glory roles, finding ways to do it in ways that are not glory, and making ourselves accountable. I really want to repeat what Abdul Ali said, in that claiming that you're an anti-racist ally does not make you anything. It does not make you an anti-racist ally, right? And so like wearing that as a badge and using that as a cover for critique is bullshit. And so we have to be accountable. We as white folk have to be accountable to people we're organizing with. And to make ourselves open to processes of accountability, right? Whether they're formal processes like someone being called out or someone just having a conversation in a meeting, and not to use this identification, whether it's an identification as an anti-racist or as an anarchist or as a this or that, not to use that as a cover, but to realize that this is an ongoing process and that we're all socialized in a pretty fucked up world, and we have to kind of undo some of that work. Yeah, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
I'm up next. Wow. I guess I want to start by saying that I am really honored to be on this panel with all of you. And thank you so much, Matt and Meg, for the invitation. My name is Sienna Mann. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently based in Denver, which is on Ute and Arapaho land. And I work for and primarily organize with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, which is a grassroots-led coalition fighting for immigrant justice. I agree that these are really big questions. I guess I'll try to answer them today by using a couple examples from my life. I first wanted to mention, in reference to one of the questions posed regarding successful examples of white anti-racist solidarity, that last year I had the opportunity to participate in the Catalyst training, the Ann Braden training for white anti-racist organizers. And I see that project as a really successful political education project. For me, it really helped me further train myself as a white organizer and deepened my analysis around white supremacy as embedded in racial capitalism and empire. They train increasingly big cohorts of folks every year. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention about my work is that I had the privilege to work in Mexico, and that was a place where I was really influenced around my anti-imperialist politics. And I had the privilege to learn from Mexican radicals and see the impact of the Zapatistas movement on youth organizing through the creation of autonomous spaces, and really saw in practice people building the world that they want to see now. And in my own organizing work, in my current context, I'm primarily organizing with undocumented leaders of color who are primarily women. And our campaigns, and I'll talk specifically about one as an example, are determined by those leaders. And so we've tried to build steering committee structures and ways of organizing that ensure that people that are directly impacted are the strategists and decision makers in every step of the process. One of our campaigns is focused on ICE resistance and abolishing what we call the Polimigra system, which is like the collaborations between law enforcement and ICE. And yeah, as you may know, the Obama administration, of course, the Trump administration massively expanded deportations, and they did this through really embedding immigration with law enforcement through databases, and also the deputization of local agents for ICE. And so the issue really at its core is around systemic racism and state violence and the policing of Black and brown communities. And directly impacted leadership in our movement took a really hard stand in this campaign against the criminalization of communities of color. And so they were absolutely unwilling to negotiate on criminal carve-outs. And it felt like that was a stand to really confront the system at its core and fight for what the community actually needed versus what was like politically easy to win. And that it became a struggle to bring broader coalition partners to the table, given the nature of that campaign was both challenging like incremental policy change, but also was really about upending a system of power. And so one of the things that we've really struggled in multiracial coalition spaces is around like gatekeeping and information withholding from nonprofits and white allies. And because of what some of y'all have mentioned around the unwillingness to take any risk or put risk in those relationships with people in power or connections to power. And so And that's partly because our committees have really shown that they're fighting to win and they're willing to take risks and call people out publicly and burn bridges when it's necessary. And so we've had to figure out ways that force people to our own tables, and on our terms being that undocumented people are at, every decision and are centered in every decision. And so that means like simple things like slowing down to interpret every single word, right, of every meeting, and making meetings accessible for people that are working and that have children. And one of the other ways that we've done this successfully is by trying to gather our own data to prove our point, so that we're not relying on other organizations to do that for us. And so Undocumented Leaders built a hotline here that is both a rapid response network and also documentation line. So we're supporting individual families, but also building our own database and story base. And so that was just, I guess, one concrete example I wanted to share of in my work, and for me, how it's a constant process of trying to ground it in that, or my organizing and accountability, and in the struggle for self-determination for the communities I'm working with. So looking forward to the rest of this conversation, and thank you again for the invitation.
Oh my God, there's so many directions and so many topics. Thank you so much. I want to start, we did sort of have this follow-up question, which I'm throwing towards Wendy. We want to have some dialogue now on the current obstacles and potentials that we see facing us right now. Wendy, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure. So I think we need to talk about white sacrifice, what white folks are willing to sacrifice. And I think we also need to talk about white class and what it means, what white class means in this dying empire. And how do we build solidarity in the working class across race, which is absolutely the most important thing we need to do when white people are, the fairy dust of white supremacy has been blown into their eyes, and they are not clear about the ways they are also exploited and oppressed. So those questions are, I mean, I'm much more comfortable talking about that than trying to figure out when white allyship has worked and all that. But I have to say though, Michael, I'm seriously inspired by some of the stuff that you talked about, just because it's like way out of my wheelhouse, and I'm probably too old or something, but don't know, just the whole idea of infiltration and exfiltration is powerful. And that's, that's a sacrifice. And so I think we need to get to the question of what white folks are willing to give up. And then perhaps we don't have to deal with, as Abdul Ali said, the question of being an ally, because white folks will get in touch with their own exploitation and oppression, and begin to see the relationships between that and the kind that we have suffered for millennia, all the while recognizing that white wealth is derived from our Black and Indigenous bodies. So there's a lot of stuff that has to be worked out in the meantime, but I think there's like a central thing that, white vulnerability and white sacrifice need to be promoted. Check.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm going to call on myself for a second here, because I think one of the questions facing us in a big way is how we interpret working class in this country. And I think as people get serious and as they become radical, they read the texts. They read a lot of the classic texts, which should all be read. I haven't read enough of them, but I've read some of them. But I was lucky when I was going through that to be a student of someone in the Puerto Rican independence movement, who was leading a study group for white allies because he wanted to build them as radicals in a certain way of thinking. And his constant challenge to us was, you have to look at the exact context of the United States when you look at this stuff. And I think a lot of people, I think a lot of white radicals start talking working class, and they don't look at what a culture of resistance and colonization within being working class means in this country. One of the terms that was in use when I started the movement was the US being described as a prison house of nations. So it's imperialist within as well as without. And I think that helps describe why there are such incredible disparities. I once heard Judith Merkinson in my youth talking about how for a long period of time, the white part of the working class was getting a little bit more than their parents every generation, and that had stopped and declined. And everything is getting worse for the white working class progressively, except they're still a little better off. There are two things I think that white people have to deal with within the working class. They still have a little bit more privilege. They might have that one last job, and they're not facing the direct violence of the state the same way. And those are two more tiny bits of privilege, and the mobilizing factor of not being the one that's being killed by the police. Those are two parts of the mobilizing that we have to deal with, I think, when we look at that.
I guess I want to piggyback on that for a very brief second, which is just to say that one of the concepts that Wendy and Abdul Ali brought up is, I think, very important to look at, this question of race traitor. And it makes me think of the biggest problem, I think, the biggest consistent problem of this work that I've experienced in my lifetime, in my decades of trying to struggle around this, around white supremacy and white privilege within the left. I think race traitor is also, as Abdul Ali said, aspirational. And I think the only occasional issue I have had with some people who use it is that, like being a traitor to one's country, you can denounce one's country and become a citizen of another country. You can't do that with white privilege and white supremacy. And the biggest problem, I think the most elusive and complicated piece of organizing, is the special white person. If you've done something really good, or you've done a couple of things really good, or you've done a couple of things really great, or you have incredibly powerful Black liberation leader friends or comrades, you can be the special white person. And I want to say, I think that's dangerous, whatever you've done, because the realities, as has been said, of growing up and being institutionalized in white supremacy is that we're all racist and we're all going to mess up. That's a given. And so in that case, there are no special white people, and the struggle has to continue. And this is a stark way of thinking about it, but I liken it to the struggle against male supremacy, sexism, heteropatriarchy, and patriarchy. I know we're not focusing on that today, but it's as if in a relationship, one person says, you know, I was really sweet to you last night, or last week, or last year, or whatever. So forgive me. In fact, you have to forgive me for beating you up today. And that just doesn't work, because today, every day is another day, and white people, whatever our histories, get white skin privilege every minute we're alive.
I'm really sorry. I just got a call from Jalil Montaquin. That's why I got up, who's a long-term political prisoner. He says hi to you, Matt and Meg. So that's all. That's what.
Jalil was mentioned by you earlier as a member of the San Francisco 8.
Yeah.
He is still a political prisoner in New York State, and he has COVID-19. So it's not inappropriate to say how he is, what's happening, how's he doing?
Well, one of the things I wanted to say in terms of, you know, when you mentioned the famous quote by Asada, actually that was a pretty good example of allyship because people, you know, work together to get her out. But there is still Mutulu Shakur, who's still in jail for her, for liberating her, and other ex-Panthers are still in jail. I mean, Jalil was incarcerated at age 19, and he is now going to be 69. So he's been in jail for 50 years. He had a ruling quite recently. We've tried to get him out. I mean, luckily his co-defendant, Herman Bell, was, after being completely beaten up, was freed 2 years ago. His other co-defendant died, Noah Washington, died in prison. But I think one of the things we have to do is really make the struggle of these prisoners, these Panther prisoners, part of our struggle, because any movement that means anything has to like protect people, and we're going to have more political prisoners, and it's really important that we do that. Mutulu Shakur has cancer and they won't let him out. All these, Sundiata Kohli had COVID, Jalil had COVID, they're very aging. And so I hope that one of the things that we can do is make their struggle to get out as part of the abolitionist movement and the excarceration. One of the things we have to do is free all these prisoners. There are over now 1,000 prisoners in San Quentin who have COVID, and they won't let them out, and it's ridiculous. And really, we have this vengeance, horrible carceral state, and that's one of the like basics of white supremacy. And I think being an abolitionist is really important, and that's been led by people of color and Black people, and I think that's something that we have to embrace.
Though the name Assata Shakur has rightfully become well known and beloved, too many of Assata's colleagues and comrades in arms are still unknown. One of them, a white woman, Marilyn Buck, spent decades behind bars as a political prisoner before being released just weeks before her death. We are honored tonight to have one of Marilyn's friends, Alicia Rodriguez, spent many years behind bars with her, Puerto Rican patriot, reading one of her poems.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you. This is a poem by Marilyn Buck. It's titled Black August, 2000. Would you hang on cliff's edge, sword sharp, slashing fingers while jackboot screws stomp heels on peeled flesh bones and laugh? Let go, die, damn you, die. Could you hang on 20 years, 30 years, 20 years, 30 years and more? Brave Black brothers buried in US concentration camps, they hang on. Black light shining in torture chambers. Rochelle, Yogi, Sondeata, Shakur, Warren, Chip, Seth, Herman, Jalil, and more they resist Black August. Nat Turner, insurrection chief, executed Black August. Jonathan, George, dead in battle's light, Black August. Fred Hampton, Black Panthers, African Brotherhood, murdered, Black August. Wazi Balakun, Nu Adul Keyang, captured warriors, dead, Black August. Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ella Baker, Ida B. Wells, Queen Mother Moore, their last breaths drawn fighting death, Black August. Black August, watchword for Black liberation, for human liberation, sword to sever the shackles, light to lead children of every nation to safety, Black August, remembrance, resist the American nightmare for life.
Another former political prisoner, in addition to Alicia Rodriguez, graces our presence tonight. Black Panther 21, Black Liberation Army, Northeast Political Prisoner Coalition leader Baba Sekou Odinga, reading the poetry of his co-defendant, David Gilbert.
Peace, power to the people. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. Okay, it's an honor to read for my comrade, David, one of the best white guys I ever met, you know. I'll just start right off reading because that's the way I do things. Fierce, volcano spew greed, hate, but 6 billion strong, we can fight and win.
Nice.
John Brown's our North Star. We know no perfection, only carry and struggle. Our politics is 17 syllables. Love for the people, love for people means non-stop struggle against imperialism. That's from my good comrade, friend, brother, David Gilbert. I appreciate him writing this and you allowing me to read it for him. All power to the people.
We're continuing on the topic of what are the obstacles and what would we like to see moving forward. And one of the things some of us have been involved in is a coalition called the People's Strike that got put together and called by Cooperation Jackson, which is an a Black and African-American cooperative down in Mississippi that follows a strategy of the radical Black movement to not simply try to rebel in cities, but to also have a base in the South where you have land and a majority of Black people living within certain states. And they put out this call, and one of the things I really liked about it is it's a call for people to come to, what's the phrasing of it? Somebody remember? It's not to be, it's to be together but not uniform in a coalition. And but then that raises issues about how do you do leadership, how do you do structure, which are still being worked out. So I don't know if anyone
Can I?
Yeah, please.
This is not about the People's Strike, but I'm sorry about that, but it was something I started thinking about. I guess a little back in the conversation, folks mentioned, I think it was Matt, about like white working class people, and then I think Michael had mentioned risk, like taking, and Sienna had talked about this training that was useful and how like having folks from the margins lead the work. So what I was thinking about was how, like somewhere in this conversation around prison abolition, there needs to be like a very intentional work. Like, I hate that word intentionality because I think it's overused, but like intentional work, I don't know what else to say, around addressing white folks, specifically white working class people, about like their benefit of the carceral state. And I'll give an example. A few years ago, and let me know if my audio is wonky. A few years ago, I did a training, an anti-oppression training with a comrade in Huntington, PA, which is a rural, like central PA town. And it was right around like the election. So it was everywhere. And it was at a domestic violence shelter. And, you know, most of the white folks there, at a certain level were politicized around being anti-racist. But I remember, to varying degrees, I guess. And I remember this one white person was really like, I guess, triggered by talking about like centering Black people and like the conversation around liberation, and specifically was upset about Black Lives Matter, right? It was like, oh, because somebody in the family was connected to, so just to give a little context, Huntington, PA, central Pennsylvania, mostly white people, and the white people in that town benefit from the fact that there's 2 prisons there. Mm-hmm. I think one minimum and one other kind of prison. I don't know if it's a maximum, but there's 2 prisons there. And, you know, again, I don't know the demographics, but I can guess that it's mostly Black and brown people in those prisons. Mm-hmm. And so this person was really upset because that was at the time that the whole Blue Lives Matter stuff came out. And like this whole like, oh, Black Lives Matter is an attack on police, right? That whole narrative, which is true, like it is an attack on police, came out. This person was upset because, you know, their like loved one worked in a prison and wasn't a cop, but was a prison worker. And I'm like, well, that person is a cop. that person is a part of the system of policing and incarceration. And so we had this back and forth to the point where she started crying, and we had to like stop the conversation there. But and it was interesting to me because, again, this person had gone to all the trainings, right, as a domestic violence advocate, and had, you know, some understanding, if limited, about solidarity and about the need to, I guess, abolish systems, but was really stuck there around like, my person is like who I love and care for benefits from the prisons being here because that's the only like job like they can get in this town. So I think that really struck me as like a space where like that person needed to like do work, or like there's a need to like unpack the benefit of like the specifically like how these small towns get prisons, right? And so then they're I guess in their minds, their survival is attached to the existence of the state apparatus in this way. But then, you know, they also are like trying to show up in some way around like solidarity work, but like have to be nudged in specific ways. Just some things I'm thinking about.
I can just jump in to say, Abdul Ali, that I think that's an example of white people needing to understand the part about risk, sacrifice, and vulnerability. That like the system is set up, the systems are set up so that shit accrues to white people because of white supremacy. And it ain't much in the scheme of things, but it's something. And so having those conversations about white vulnerability, about risk and sacrifice, I think are really important.
I agree. Thank you, Wendy.
I'll offer like a half-baked thought, which keeps occurring to me, is that the examples that I drew from are fundamentally different than some of the other examples because I was talking about symptoms of white supremacy, right? Like the existence of the far right is a symptom of white supremacy. And so I think that there's a fair number of examples of people plugging in at the symptom level, right? Stopping the manifestation of racial violence or racial inequality. But I'll say that I don't know of inspiring examples I'd get behind philosophically, politically, of people undoing white supremacy or challenging, you know, structural racism and the fact that the nation state is built on that logic. And so I think when I think of a lot of the ways in which people attempt to kind of move themselves from, you know, as the pamphlet says, from allyship to accomplice, most of those are kind of frontline work, right? They're in meetings, they're on the ground, but most of those don't seem to contribute to undoing the privilege that we have, at the national, at the international level, at the structural level. So, I'm not posing a question, which I realize we probably have very little answers to, but I'd be interested in talking about some of the ways in which white folks can ally in that undoing process, more than just dealing with the output that is produced by systems of white supremacy.
Okay, that's very good, challenging. I'm going to say a couple things that I hope are connected to that, because that's profound. I think that because racism is so central to the way our economic system works, that when it's truly being attacked as a symptom, it helps people get closer to that whole structural systematic thing that has to be fought. But I also think that we are looking at a time when we need to make big coalitions that do deal with work strikes, and that the platform of the Movement for Black Lives has a lot of stuff that's basically about, let's change its distribution of all income in this country and the center of violence in this country. And I see that with People Strike, and I see that with the Movement for Black Lives, and I hope the kind of unity amongst all those forces keeps going, because it's very powerful. And within that, I think we can find our roles. Like, some people might be better at infiltration, and other people might be better at some of the work that Surge does of calling people in and talking to them and calling them in. But not everybody's going to get called in. That's just a fact about white people. So we're going to have some people called in, and some people we have to be protected from. And I want to do a shout out to Antifa in terms of protection, because since they've been semi-labeled as a terrorist organization, I don't think officially, but it was just thrown out there. I want to make sure we're calling them in as defenders of the movement and protectors. So that's just a few. I'm going to stop. Enough talking. Other people.
Can I say quickly to I'm sorry, I'm taking up space. Actually, I'm not sorry. I'm practiced at saying I'm sorry. So I'm a part of this conversation around some white folks I had lived with giving up their house to like Black people in Philly and gentrified Southwest Philadelphia, where I'm from. And this is like the second time that I've been part of this conversation. So there was another white friend of mine, gave up their house in West Philly, in like Powelton, to a group of mostly Black people. And, these are folks who have access to wealth, or they bought these, well, the one house was a collective house, right? So they had equity from multiple white people, and those white people were willing to give up that equity and give that house over. And then this second house is owned by two people who are married, and they are wanting to move away from Philadelphia and give the house to Black people. And this goes to your question, Michael, around risk, and also like how can people materially like move things into Black hands, I guess. And these are two examples of like white folks being uncomfortable, right? Giving up a lot of money and or connection to money through the house, and like just saying, hey, like, here's the deed. The first house that I heard about this friend giving up, it was no strings, right? It was just like Black people. Here you go. And the second formation is like, oh, we want to give it to a group of Black people, but we want it to be a Black co-op, right? A housing co-op or a Black community land trust. So in this context, like they are wanting some kind of assurance that it's in the hands of some kind of group that is that has like values alignment or has a connection to like cooperative economics. And so those two things I think are useful in the context of like specifically around like how displacement impacts Black leadership, because you know, if you like thinking about myself as like a person who organizes around HIV a lot, being POS and being in a city where a lot of Black and brown POS people are homeless or housing insecure, you know, and this is an example from like, I guess, ACT UP Philly. I'm affiliated with ACT UP Philly, and so I know, speaking specifically to Jose DeMarco, who holds a lot of that labor, about like, you know, a lot of times white social workers kind of take up space in ACT UP spaces because they have time, resources, comfortability to like do all the things, and like POS folks are like trying to survive, trying to take their meds, you know, trying to like not be unhoused. And so I think part of it is like, how do you ensure that folks have what's necessary to show up for leadership roles, right? So that like, you know, because I guess speaking personally, having been struggling with housing recently, right? If the first thing I'm thinking about is a roof over my head, I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm going to lead this, you know, the conversation in this multiracial coalition about visioning about, you know, the future. I need to get a house or I need to get a roof over my head. So I think those are some of the things, if people are well resourced as white folks, that folks can do to like ensure that, you know, Black leadership can lead.
Can I just add that as we enter ever more deeply into this pandemic and the economic collapse, those kind of questions are going to be ever more pressing, because there will be more and more houseless, jobless, deeply food insecure people.
Well, I live in the Bay Area, and I live in the western part of the city, and so I hadn't gone like downtown or anywhere for months. And recently I went, and the situation here is so incredibly terrible. There are tents everywhere, and there's all these empty houses. And I think we have, like you say, what are the symptoms? We have to build a movement that demands that these empty houses get opened up, or there were all these hotel rooms. You know, we have to demand that those hotel rooms get opened up and people get put in.
I think we have to occupy. I think we have to occupy those houses and not do demanding. Just move it.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to say something else. I wanted to say, why do people think that this moment actually has moved millions and millions of people? Why do we see a shift, even though half of it could drive you crazy? Like, you know, you can now buy a Black Lives Matter poster on Amazon, which, you know, is sort of symptomatic of everything. But it's interesting to me that so many people have been moved in this movement, in this moment. And I think also that the question of white supremacy isn't just an economic one and white working class people, it's an ideological one. And a lot of people who have voted, you know, for the right wing, or who going, you know, watching those rallies where you feel like you're in fascist America, it's not because economically they're better off or they're going to be better off. It's because psychologically and ideologically they're better off. And I think those two things are in competition with each other. Why are people being moved, and then why do people not be moved?
I just want to add something in, just because I think Meg said the word Antifa, and I think one of the reasons I was asked to be here is that I work within those networks. Is that I think specifically in the context of the George Floyd rebellion, or whatever you'd like to call it, that when that term is used, specifically when that term is used by the White House, that what they really mean is white anti-racists. And we need to really understand that. Like, we need to be on the forefront of decoding that. And we can, again, use the term race traitor, but that really is what is meant there. When they say Antifa, they mean white anti-fascists who are willing to be confrontational. And just to be clear, anti-fascists and anti-racists broadly obviously come from a multiracial perspective or a multiracial community, and every Antifa event that I've been a part of has been very multiracial. But when we hear the term of outside agitators, Antifa are coming to do this or that, or Antifa are coming to tell people to provide them with bricks, we need to call that out as not only symptomatic of white supremacy, right? The notion that like leftists, communists, Jews basically like, rile everyone up and get all the black people angry and give them the bricks, right? Like, that's an old narrative that dates back to, anti-Klan stuff from hundreds of years ago. And that's a racist narrative. And so when they kind of demonize anti-fascists through this, like, and AG Barr has done this a lot in the last couple of weeks, they really are trying to drive wedges between white people willing to put themselves at risk, white people willing to, confront police, and other people. And I think we need to call that out for what it is. It's race baiting, and it's an attempt to kind of factionalize movements.
Thank you for saying that. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say thank you, Michael, because I was involved in the conversation online about like that need, right? That need to like be more critical and like call that out, because part of what happened in Philly is like a lot of people saying, oh, look at these quote unquote outside agitators burning things, right? And that came up in Atlanta too, and we find out that person is the girlfriend of the person that the cops killed, right? And so how movement space was used to target and surveil and like track, right, this person, because people were like, oh, this is a white person that's like trying to agitate. So I think you're absolutely right about like how that is so like that is racist as fuck, right? And also it, like I said this to some folks online, like the fact that people think that black people don't know the difference between infiltration and like folks who are in solidarity is so fucked up. Like that's anti-black as fuck, right? Because there was a lot of white people saying, black people, be mindful of these white folks at your actions, as if like we don't know what infiltration is. Like we know infiltrator versus like someone who's like willing to put their, bodies on the line or like fuck some shit up for black people or for liberation or for, we know the difference. And so like it is like a discounting of the understanding of like, I guess expertise, like people in black spaces, like being experts, right? Too, like, oh, be careful. And these are like the signs of infiltration. It's like, you're like not being useful or helpful as a white person when you do that. And so
decades of experience in black and brown communities with the counterintelligence program, which is like, the FBI's counterintelligence program. Like black and brown communities are the best suited to understand and know that history and to embody that history. So like, why wouldn't folks know that?
I'm going to call on myself for a second. One thing is we have probably about 8 minutes left, I think, at this point. But I want to go back a little bit to Merck's. I think you guys are getting into some of the really important obstacles we have to figure out, is like the lies, the counterintelligence, the things that will split things. But I want to also say that as someone in Extinction Rebellion, I've seen how this, the Floyd Rebellion has matured a lot of the thinking in Extinction Rebellion. And I'm just going to say, more than ever, I think all people know that our imperialist, capitalist, greedy system is killing all of us. And, if for white people that first comes to them as either horror at what's happening to black people with the police, or as, horror about the environment, there's I think there's a potential here for real lifelong commitment to getting rid of this greedy system that's destroying us. So that's a hope I have. Last
Can
words.
I say something? Oh.
Yeah.
I guess these are my last words. So I want to say to Merck's point about like why do we find, it was something about why are we at this moment, or why is it like, why are so many people connected to this moment, I guess. And it made me think about a book that I read, which is The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. I don't know, it's about nonprofits and how nonprofits are part of like controlling dissent. And I think about this often, like how like, you know, things like an ACT UP turned into a lot of HIV nonprofits that are hella problematic, right? And surveil positive people for the state, right? And how they track pos people, and they claim we care about pos people. But, you know, they find their roots in like radical ass collectives like ACT UP, but then become this like whitewashed, co-opted thing. And I think about that often when I see a Black Lives Matter sign, or like, you know, when people are painting the street in the yellow paint, or people are like, you know, I go on like line and Amazon is like Black Lives Matter, or like fucked up ass corporations are like Black Lives Matter. I think about how it makes me think about like the need for asymmetry in like our tactics, like speaking to what Michael talked about. But it also like it's a tactic of silencing like actual work, right? Because, and I saw this in Philly, like, you know, we did a lot of the BBWC, the Black and Brown Workers Co-op, we did a lot of work around calling out white supremacy in LGBT spaces. Because, you know, white queer people and white trans people are always like, we're oppressed too, and so we can't be racist. And it's like, nah, you're still white. But in doing that work, you know, what came out of it was that Black and brown pride flag. And so now people have the symbol and they're like, oh, inclusion, right? And I hate that word inclusion. Oh, we have arrived and we don't have work to do. So it was used, so that movement and that work was used to then say like, we're done. White queer people and white trans people understand white supremacy, and this flag is a testament to it. And so let's not continue to dive into the problematic nature of these institutions in the same way that the Black Lives Matter sign and hashtag is being used now to be like, oh, we're done the work, right? My final thoughts.
We turn now to a special action report on the July 4th fire and thunder action here in Brooklyn. Robert Cuffey is a leader of the National People's Strike. He's an international leader of the Socialist Workers Alliance of Guyana, and he's a member of the DSA Afro-Socialist Caucus. Robert was attacked a week before July 4th in preparing for this action, but now is talking to us about the plans to keep on going and to keep the struggle continuing. Robert Cuffey, People's Strike.
Hi, yes, thank you for having me. So on July 4th, riffing on Frederick Douglass's What to a Slave is the 4th of July, we'll be having a demonstration starting in East New York, Brooklyn at Broadway Junction, which is this huge transit hub. It's also a nexus that's targeted for remodeling and gentrification as a way to become a gateway into the easternmost part of Brooklyn, which remains maybe the only, outside of Brownsville, the only ungentrified parts of Brooklyn, even though that's happening in the ones and twos. So the plan is to foreground in East New York to talk about the role of the transit workers in keeping the city moving and the criminal ways in which they weren't provided with PPE, the disproportionate number of deaths there, and to talk about the neglect of the community of immigrants and Black people in Cypress Hills and East New York. So we'll be doing a speak out there to start off our rally, then marching into Brownsville to various locations, and then farther west into Brooklyn, ending at Restoration Plaza, which is now dubbed Abolition Plaza.
Robert, you were obviously targeted and picked off in a demonstration at City Hall a couple of days ago. What are your thoughts and some of the comrades' thoughts about security at this point in our history?
Well, I think self-defense, especially by any means necessary, is something that's becoming more and more of a conversation as people have been planning protests, making themselves more visible, especially in an era where a president has been going after activists under the label of Black identity extremists, especially in an era where we have the New York Three who are being victimized for allegedly firebombing NYPD trucks in a very special way, where even the local prosecutor is not filing the charges, but there are federal charges being filed against these people where they're denied basic things like bail, even though they're nonviolent first-time offenders and, you know, have no history of doing such things. They're being going after by the federal government, being charged with such, being overcharged in such a way that they could face 40 years to life in prison. It's definitely a time for us to come together and build defense and security amongst each other.
And by the way, how are you feeling? How's that arm? Robert had his arm dislocated.
Yeah, so I'm wearing a sling, which is why my arm is not coming out of this shirt, as a precaution, because when I did get my arm popped back in, my shoulder popped back into the socket, I was told that, yes, your range of motion is improved, but if you use your arm too much, the dislocation can happen again. So the sling is a precaution against such movement, and I have to follow up with an orthopedist on Monday.
And of course, we send you love and healing energies and solidarity for, you know, strength out there, as we know you're going to continue to be out there despite having that pain and that cast. Last question. All of your organizations, from the local to the regional to the international, seem to be coming together and working with this new force, this new movement called People's Strike. What do you see as the possibilities for People's Strike, the importance of it, and the strategic direction of where we need to go from here?
Well, when the People's Strike was launched, people had what I would say were legitimate criticisms and concerns about it, right? Like, who is launching the People's Strike and what ability do they have to actually affect strikes, especially in the workplaces? Now, if you say, okay, the People's Strike was launched primarily by Cooperation Jackson and the Black Socialists of America, one would ask naturally, well, what workplace, what forces within the workplace do they have that can affect strikes? And while I myself had those criticisms, I also noticed that at least in New York City, there were no other forces planning actions for May Day, a day of great significance, International Workers' Day, and the significance made even greater under the conditions of COVID-19, this huge public health crisis and economic crisis, one of mass unemployment. So I took it as an opportunity to organize on behalf of International Workers' Day. And you saw there was this rising organic forces within various workplaces of workers who were previously kind of discarded, right? Workers, retail workers who, for the most part, were not seen as powerful, but because they were the ones who kept the stores open and kept the supply chains going, they gained this enormous amount of power in the same way that, you know, capitalism creates its own gravediggers. So it was a very opportune time to build forces with people going on strike at Amazon, Whole Foods, and Trader Joe's and these other places, in addition to the car caravan we built for that day. And I think the need to have a coalition, both a national coalition and local coalitions, fighting for actions on the 1st of the month really was proven true when we built actions for June 1st. And it happened just in the wake of the uprising in Minneapolis in response to the police murder of George Floyd. And what we thought would be a protest that would hopefully turn out a few hundred people turned into a protest that turned out thousands of people in such force that we were able to march onto and shut down the FDR highway in New York City while maintaining safety and not even having one person arrested.
As we end this program, with special thanks to all our guests, extraordinary gratitude to former political prisoners and dear comrades, leaders, Baba Sekou Odinga and Alicia Rodriguez, and also to Nejma Nefertiti for opening us up with her great song. We close with the recognition that settler colonialism continues, just as we learn about the myth of the white proletariat in the US from Jay Sakai's book Settlers, we also understand that settler colonialism, occupation, and militarism exists everywhere to this day. We close then with a poem read by our dear Brooklyn comrade Dequi Keone Siddiqui, who chose to read a poem about Palestine. And after that, our closing credits, A People's History of White Supremacy by our friend Dave Lippman. Now, to take us home, Dequi.
So I'm honored to be here. Thank you for including us here this evening, Matt. I am going to share with you this incredible poet, Jessica Care Moore, a poem from her book, God is Not an American. And I chose this poem because with so much happening in Palestine, and there was just a big Brooklyn rally in support of Palestine, this past Wednesday that I participated. And my dear husband has on his Palestinian shirt. I just think that it's all in fitting. And Matt, you have your Palestinian mask on. So we're clearly all within the same frame of mind representing. So Jessica Care Moore wrote this poem entitled For the Children of Gaza. I have no windows, no doors in my home. My neighborhood, sports clubs, schools, hospitals are now targets for artillery shells. Only a generator to keep me connected to the outside world. Remember when wars had rules? Remember when you can find our land on a map? These drones do not see us as people. Our children are not their children. Their small bodies scattered on the street like torn pieces of paper from a headline. Empty words and no truth about their story attached to tiny limbs blown off. Fingers, arms, teenage bodies cut in half. This blood is too new to be spilled. Still finding its way, swimming past young, soft bones. Hundreds killed, thousands wounded. Children are told to hide with their families in schools, and then the building is shelled. Innocents stolen, and they are left with this moment for eternity. Left alone for days, holding on to the limp bodies of their dead mothers, asking them to wake up. They want to go home, but they are home. What does this mean to the rest of the world, I wonder? Is democracy at work? What are the hours? 9 to 5? We can't tell the night from day. I think freedom is at lunch or taking a Monday off to a barbecue. Today, I choke in search of fresh air without shrapnel cutting my tongue. I eat bombs. I tell myself they cannot kill me. I think about God, the God everyone claims they pray to. Where is God now? Sitting in the North Star, invading another country as a distraction, hiding inside a rocket launcher, blowing up a mosque? Murder in the name of God. What is closer to God than children laughing? Maybe we should begin praying to that sound. I suppose there were bombs in their lunchboxes as they attempted normalcy by still walking to school, or the sisters who were burnt to death in their sleep. The fireworks are death lights here with no musical score. My friend says he hopes if he's killed, children are killed so they won't be suffering inside this massacre of this attack on civilian life alone. We understand, Toni Morrison. Beloved are the women who take their children with them, jump off sides of ships, rooftops. To hear a father talk this way, anything but pain and death as a way of life. One of their Israeli missiles screams out, "We are not the enemy," then tore through the body of a pregnant woman of 2 Palestinian boys. Their mothers promised them change. Now velvet blood and prayer beads cover their mouths and hands. They died with Allah in their heart and their hands toward the sun. This is not new news, if news at all. The F-16 choppers attacked homes with 20 missiles in less than 5 minutes. Soldiers march inside my mouth, slide down my throat, crawl inside my womb, and leave a hand grenade. So I feel this war as a birth, but of what? Of blood, of bone, of children's bones, of decapitation, of hate, of geography. Occupation always produces violence, but I'm asked to speak of peace. How can I, with bombs exploding, killing the unborn and their siblings? Why is genocide acceptable to some people and not to others? Holocaust versus Holocaust versus Holocaust. The ones they celebrate, the ones they never mention. I feel as if I'm burnt to ash, my shoes being thrown into a pile of other shoes. My ancestors ripped from their homeland and sold like cattle. The place with God on their money. Are they going to save me now? Where is America? In a series of long meetings mourning the loss of the family cat? There is no place for politics in the face of genocide, but genocide is political, religious. How much money to clean the blood off the streets of DC, Texas, Ohio, Baltimore? We already dead, they think. Still, we fight without armor. Our children's dead flesh becomes our skin. We wear the mask, attempt the smiles. I don't jump as much when I hear them coming, falling right on my block. I just hold on to an object and shake inside and wait for it to be over. It is never over. It is freezing cold in summer. I dream of warm food and a hot shower. I dream of freedom in Chicago, in Detroit, Harlem, in Brooklyn, in Soweto, in Compton, in Oklahoma, in Kansas, in Cuba, in Gaza. End apartheid in South Africa, in Alabama, in our education system, in our subconscious, in Dearborn, in Mississippi, in our judicial system, in our prisons, in our policies, in our death chambers, in our mind. End apartheid in Gaza, our mosque, our homes destroyed. In Gaza, some of our own sit in silence in Gaza. There's no electricity in Palestine. There is no water. Where there is no water, there is no life. I scrape the blackness of this night sky on fire and wrap it around myself for shelter. Tomorrow, I will find a cloud for my head and I will summon a light rain to shower. God is close. God is coming between our breaths. Before another bomb calls our name, we will answer back. We will sit in one room. If we die together. No one will be left behind. This is the bravery of God's people. We will not cower beneath the rubble of a Rafia refugee camp. We will scream, we will pray, and justice in the other direction. We will find peace in life, in death, We will find peace in death, if not in life. I mean, Jessica Care Moore, for the children of Gaza.
Blessings, we're continuing our lessons. Is our history such a mystery? No, this won't be on the quiz. See, if you give some folks a better shake than the other ones, taller or the shorter ones, they will take the road to ruin. They may not know what they're doing. It will be a circle jerk. It won't work. Cul-de-sac, no going back. No going back, no going back. Power corrupts, it interrupts. Equal rights, it disrupts. And then after a while, you get your empires gunning for the profits that are running, grabbing land and killing humans only. If you can't enslave them, taking what they say God gave them. And those pirates so violate, cloak themselves in church and state. Flash forward to the days when, emerging from the haze of World War, the newest nation became the leader of the pack and attacked anyone who would dare to block that track. Block that track. Come the 60s, this great nation was taken to a war against its poor. Darker people, both at home and across the sea, but the youth exclaim no more. Show old school right out the door. For a minute we were winning, but we were only beginning. Beginning. Powers at work earning their forces, pledged and plotted to retain resources, reasserting their dominion. going so far to the right, you won't recognize it. But still they will disguise it with dog whistles and epistles to the sanctity of whiteness. There will be no white contriteness. Everything after was a slide, all our progress nullified, putting people back in boxes, chickens caged guarded by foxes, military thugs in blue, yes they do know what they do. Orange madness rise up racists who fear rounds will take their places. Orange man would like another orange bird, another orange bird, orange bird. Then there was an interregnum, freedom fighters all to keep my black man in a White House, in like lying out like meatballs, even so infuriating. Those used to dominating, some small status they'd enjoy, declaring others null and void. The only way to really quit is to openly admit the hurt and rage of those who cannot turn the page and close the book on this regime of greed and lying, of theft and occupying, which parades itself as greatness. If we're willing, we can break with our own past, because democracy with inequality can never last. Imagine a world like white suburbanites already have no daily terror from the wearer of the badge and gun. What fun! America was conquered and destroyed, grabbing treasure for their pleasure. It was looted, loot rooted, then the people must rebel, raising up the decibel, without which we'll ne'er do well. Democracy with inequality can never last. So they kill and kill, but yet and still there will be a limit when the people rise against it, and the people say to profit, that's enough, come on off it, and then perhaps we'll see whether folks like you and me can learn to see through boys in blue and know exactly what to do, what to do, what to do, what to do. We don't want to burn it down, but if these clowns won't come around, well, they better know it's gonna blow, and it won't be so pretty in the city of murder and despair. Oh, yes, they are restoring order, and the order of the day is, of course, not what they say. There's talk of cop brutality, of racialized mentality, police recruited to defend a brutal order we can see is futile. There's no border twixt the brute and the two who decides and divides the downtrodden. So broaden your view, see that you may not be the one with the gun, but you may have freedom and a nest egg, while others sit on a powder keg. This ain't new as I think you knew, it don't date from yesteryear. I feel, look at the widescreen, it dates from 1619. America was conquered and destroyed, grabbing treasure for their pleasure. It was looted, rooted, then the people must rebel, raising up the decibel with